I've spent the majority of my career working with cattle feed yards. I was consulted for many years, and then my largest feed yard consulting client asked me to come on staff, and I joined Cattle Empire Feed Yards in 2011. And then just this past summer, Cattle Empire sold the majority of its holdings to Friona Industries, which is another large cattle feeding company. And so I had the opportunity to join Friona, but my kids are growing up and moving away and living in another part of the state and starting to have grandkids, and we're soon to be empty nesters, so we decided to take advantage of another opportunity, and now I'm working for Merck Animal Health. I'm still focused in the feed yards. But I promised myself a few years ago that no one was ever going to get through, listen to me speak without learning how to say my last name. So there it is in all its glory. And it's pronounced Smith. No, that's not right. Sjeklocha. 3 simple syllables. The J is silent. My wife likes to say it's just there to scare you. And here's a little cheat for you. Have you ever been looking for something and it's right under your nose? It's so close you almost missed it. It's Sjeklocha, almost missed it. Okay? And for some of you that like the phonetics, that's Sjeklocha. So we're going to say that. Sjeklocha. Very good. We got her nailed. So today I'm going to talk about foreign animal disease outbreaks. Would you, when I got 10 minutes left, would you give me some kind of a wave or something? Because I know I'm not going to get through all this. But we're going to talk about some disasters that we may face, foreign animal disease outbreaks, wildfires, and blizzards. And I guess I can kind of say I have experience with all 3 of these, at least in an arm's length way. But I want to make sure we understand that that there's a difference between depopulation and euthanasia. To depopulate just simply means to substantially reduce the population, period. Now, we may use euthanasia, which is to put a living being to death in a humane way. We may use that to depopulate or to end suffering. But I think we need to understand that a lot of laypersons will think that depopulate and euthanize are synonymous, and they're not. And I think we need to make sure they understand that. So if we talk about foreign animal diseases, the one that we're most concerned about and would probably provide the biggest concern to the United States would be foot and mouth disease. That's kind of the classic. It's a viral disease. It affects cloven hooved animals. It's very, very, very highly contagious. The last case we had in the U.S. was in 1929, so it's been a while, and we're very fortunate because of that. But by the same token, the rules that are written on how to deal with foot and mouth disease was written shortly thereafter. So since 1929, and maybe some of you have picked up on this, agriculture has changed a little bit. So I want to make sure we understand that it is not the same as hand, foot, and mouth disease, which affects humans. A lot of people, if there is an outbreak of hand, foot, and mouth disease in humans, they say, well, what's that going to do to our livestock? Nothing. So we're safe there. And foot and mouth disease really does have a relatively low death loss if it ever does hit. Animals can respond to it very well, but there is some death loss, and it really does affect the production of those animals. So it can be spread almost any way you can think of, but primarily fomites. It can be carried by anything, water, clothes, footwear. It can be in the feed. You can transfer it around with feed. Any tractors, loaders, feed trucks, needles. If you inject an animal and use the same needle on the next one, you can pass the disease. It is endemic in many countries throughout the world. But if a country is declared free and it gets infected with FMD, then it's going to be devastating financially to that country because export markets are cut off. And especially here in the U.S., where we depend so much on our export markets in any of the meats, why if we lost those markets, we'd basically be forced to consume all that protein domestically. And that's another good point, is it is not a food safety issue. The meat from these animals is still safe to eat. So if we look at the USDA FMD plan as it was written, it says within 24 hours or as soon as possible, infected livestock will be euthanized or depopulated. So 24 hours, that's a pretty tall order, and that may be feasible on a small operation, a 30-head cow herd or something like that. It'd be very easy to go in and depopulate that group. But when you're looking at feed yards, which is going to be the focus of this talk, we're looking at, there's many feed yards that are at least 10,000 head, and there's going to be more and more that are 100,000 head or more. There's 100,000 head feed yard has become a pretty commonplace, and there's lots in the 80 to 90,000 head range. So the Kansas Department of Agriculture puts on exercises every year where they simulate an FMD outbreak. And the company I worked for at the time, Cattle Empire, as one of the really neat things about working for them was they wanted to be involved in these things. And so we volunteered to be an index yard for them. And so Cattle Empire consisted of one 56,000 head feed yard, and it was the one that was considered the true index yard. About 6 miles to the southwest was an 87,000 head feed yard that Cattle Empire owns. Further southwest is a 34,000 and a 18,000 head yard. And then straight north of this index yard was a 52,000 head Holstein calf ranch. So if you add all that up, that's 247,000 head of cattle capacity. Now, obviously, we didn't have 247,000 head of cattle on feed, but it was at least 225,000. But we're going to stick with the 247 just for a means of demonstration. When we came up with the exercise, our Kansas Secretary of Agriculture, Jackie McClaskey, she got to make the call on what would happen. So she determined that we needed to depopulate. And originally her plan was depopulate this yard and everything but the calf ranch. And I think the only reason she didn't pick the calf ranch is because she didn't have enough information. Because the truth be told, this yard and the calf ranch had a lot more exchange of equipment and people than any of the other yards did. But all of them still had some exchange of equipment, even some feed. So I would assume that if this was a real situation, within a couple days she'd have decided that calf ranch needed to be depopulated as well. So if we were to do that, if we were to depopulate 247,000 head of cattle in 24 hours, we'd have to kill 10,292 head per hour, or 172 head per minute, or 2.9 head every second. And that's moving cattle through awful fast. To offset that, there were 20 cattle handling facilities across all those operations. So if we put them all through the cattle handling facilities, it'd still be 515 head per facility per hour, or 8.6 head per minute. That's still going to be an awful tough row to hoe. And the model was that we would use either a captive bolt or a firearm. In the past, there's always been discussion of poisoning these cattle, but from a humane perspective, it's not going to look good if we would do that. So we'd be catching each of these animals individually and putting them in the squeeze chute and either using a firearm or a captive bolt to euthanize them. Yes, sir.
So if you were using a firearm, why was it necessary to catch it? There are other plans that if you use high-powered rifle, it won't be a sudden death euthanasia, but it will be it will be a shot to kill.
Yeah.
And obviously, you could decrease the period of time
Yeah.
that it took if you had a bunch of sharpshooters shoot, like National Guard.
Yeah. I would submit, the question is, why would you catch them all one by one and use your firearm when you could just go out and use a sharpshooter? And I would submit that you would have cattle tearing down fences and the disease would be spread all over the countryside within, your first 10 shots. When you've got cattle standing in a group and you shoot one, he drops, and you shoot another one and he drops, and then the other ones are starting to move around, and the sharpshooters are having to reposition to get a shot, those cattle are going to get stirred up. And I would submit that those fences will go down before too long, and then we'd have the disease spread much farther. And if we can get to the wildfires talk, we saw that in those wildfires. So if we do captive bolt or firearm these animals in the chute, then he has to be removed from the chute, which just takes more time. And then, as far as other things we'll need for this, we're going to need land for either a burial site or a compost site. So think about the number of animals we're talking about here. How big a burial site are you going to need? Now, Secretary McClaskey decided that she wanted to use the feed we had on site to compost these animals, and still that was going to take a huge site. I mean, it really didn't reduce the size. By virtue of that, we were probably going to have to fence off that entire compost site to keep coyotes from coming in and getting a free lunch, because they'd come in and dig on it, and badgers and whatever other kind of varmints may be. And we got a lot of coyotes in southwest Kansas. If we think about the equipment that's going to be needed in that situation, we're going to have loaders or tractors to pull cattle out of the chute after they've been euthanized. Then we're going to have loaders to put them in the trucks to haul them to the compost or burial site. We're going to have to load the feed trucks to get feed to the burial site. We're going to have plenty of trucks to do all that as well. We're going to haul them to the burial site and haul the feed to the compost site. If we dig a hole, we're going to have some bulldozers. Most feed yards don't have bulldozers, at least bulldozers big enough to really dig a hole fast. Bulldozers would probably also be needed to push the feed up on top of the animals to compost them. Captive bolts and firearms, it's going to take a lot of them. Those have a tendency to get hot the more we use them. So they're going to break down and they're going to get dirty. You're going to have to clean them frequently. So that's one of the beauties of living in redneck America, is there's plenty of firearms around, but you're going to have to get them there. Captive bolt charges, ammunition. If you use a compressed air captive bolt, then you might need a whole bunch of air compressors. And the other end of this is, I think it's pretty clear we're not going to get this done in a day, and we're probably going to have to do it in shifts. And so we're going to have to decontaminate, have some sort of decontamination facility there on site to get the people in and out. And again, we're looking at on this situation, we're looking at 5 different sites. And then the other thing we have to consider is the people. We need some people that can operate equipment such as trucks and loaders. And we're going to need a lot of them. We're going to need people that can move cattle. And that was another thing you mentioned, the Army sharpshooters. One of the things that was suggested in this particular instance was that we wouldn't even use the Cattle Empire employees. We'd just bring in soldiers and they'd move the cattle. Well, if you've ever looked at the aerial view of a feed yard, there's an intricate trail of alleyways to get cattle to different places. And in most yards, you're probably going to waste half a day for those guys trying to figure out what gates to swing to get the cattle where they need to be. And how many soldiers actually have livestock experience and can move them. So we're probably going to have to figure out a way to keep some of the local people there. Then you've got the people, we're going to need people in the handling facilities to move the cattle through the tub, the alley, the snake, the whole 9 yards. And that takes people with a little bit of livestock experience. And then we have to think about the people that are doing the euthanizing, because that's going to be a tough job. I've been involved in some situations, research situations, where quite a few cattle have been euthanized, and it gets old, and it starts playing with your mind. So we're gonna have some people available that can tolerate that and can break up the monotony of it, because there is going to be an issue with their mental status. So I'm going to submit that the depopulation is not feasible in a feed yard. Just imagine how large a burial site would be needed for 10,000 head. So if you say a steer's 7-8 feet long, if you dug a hole 8 feet wide and allowed 2 feet for every animal, laid them side by side in that hole, you would be out at 3.8 miles for 10,000 head. And again, there's a lot of 100,000 head feed yards. So a simple old K-Stater like me, I can say, well, 10,000 times 10 is 100,000, so 3.8 times 10 is 38 miles. That's a big hole. So what we're pushing for is to develop a vaccination program and vaccinate our way out of it. And some very smart people at Iowa State, and I personally was involved in this a little bit, but I want to give Iowa State all the credit. Dr. Danelle Bickett-Weddle headed this up and created the Secure Beef Supply Plan. And that's the address. If you Google Secure Beef Supply, it'll tell you what it is. But one of the weaknesses we have there is we don't have enough vaccine. We've just got a couple million doses of vaccine in reserve to handle this. And that's not going to do squat in a big outbreak. It's not going to do squat. So we could utilize that vaccine, what we have in place, and then it's going to be several weeks before the vaccine manufacturing process is up and running and can get more vaccine to us. So we've been petitioning the USDA to spend a little money each year on making our vaccine supply more robust. Now, before we go on to wildfires, I gave this talk a few months ago, or a similar talk in Kansas City, and afterwards someone suggested that why don't you just, like you said, sharpshoot them, leave them where they lay, bury them with manure, and be done with it. And the truth is, a lot of those feed yard facilities, once they are determined to be FMD free, somebody's going to want to use them again. And if we bury the cattle in place in the pens, we're going to be out of luck there. Yes, sir.
There's a compost expert, whatever, and about 10 years ago, I asked him, I said, if you have a pen of cattle in a feed yard, could you put big squares around the whole perimeter of that pen, 2 or 3 high, bring in the sharpshooter, depopulate, shoot the cattle on site, and then compost them? He said if you have an 18-inch manure pad, which most feedlots do, he said you could do that. Mm-hmm. And you would have enough room. Therefore, then you could reuse that compost in 6 to 8 weeks, and with the trade implications and so on and so forth, you're not going to be getting back in there in 8 weeks.
Yeah, right. No, and that's right. The only problem I'd have with that is, for instance, that 87,000 head yard, you got to think about the enormity of these operations. That 87,000 head yard within it had 22 miles of feed bunk. It's a big operation. I'd hate to guess where you're going to find big bales to stack 3 high to completely encircle that thing, let alone the other 4 or 5 operations. And the downside of the vaccine thing, in my opinion, is that workers, the owner of that feed yard, the owner of those cattle, he's probably broke because his market's gone, and he's got a lot of money invested in them. Who's going to pay to vaccinate those cattle? Who's going to vaccinate it? How are they going to get paid? And will there be any indemnity for the owner of those cattle? So, even though we may save them and eventually slaughter them, there's some fallout from there. I need to keep moving here. Thank you. Wildfires. We had a Starbuck fire in southwest Kansas just a couple years ago. And when it comes to euthanasia, in this situation, these are a case-by-case decision. You may go out there and see cattle that are blind. They've had their teats burned off, so they can't feed a calf anymore. You may have bulls that have their testicles burned, so they're not able to do their business. Hoof damage, severe hide burns. These are all just a few of the reasons why you may want to euthanize cattle after a wildfire. And you can see here, these are pictures of the aftermath of that Starbuck fire that we had just, I believe it's 2 years ago now. Things to keep in mind: that most of the time the fences are gone in that situation. This is about as good a fence as you saw that survived the wildfire. Cattle will, if the fire doesn't take it, usually a lot of cattle are pressing against it and knock it down. So it's hard to contain the cattle. They're scattered everywhere. Neighbors' herds are mixed together. It's hard to read brands on some of those burned cattle. And a lot of ranchers it really be hard for a lot of ranchers to make the decision to shoot their own neighbor's cow unless they see it suffering, they know it needs to be euthanized, but doggone it, should I shoot my neighbor's cow or should I have him come over and do it? So those are some of the things that we're faced with there. When it comes to euthanasia, a lot of those situations are very obvious. And the ones that are obvious are usually so debilitated that you can get them at close range with a handgun, possibly a captive bolt, and maybe even euthanasia solution. But it's the other ones that are challenging. The cattle have been through a terrifying experience, so they're not willing to stand around very well, and we saw this. Small groups of cows would be standing together, and their teats are burned off, or they were blind, and there were several in that group that needed to be euthanized, and so people would start shooting them, and after 2 or 3 shots, those cattle were starting to run. Even if they couldn't see, they'd go run off somewhere to try to get away from it. And the thing that we have to keep in mind is that in the feed yard, the cowboys and the workers there are around the cattle for each animal for 6 or 8 months. But these ranchers have spent years with these cattle, and there's an emotional attachment there. A lot of times, some of the cattle were their kids' 4-H projects, so it goes back in the family a long ways. Another thing that has kind of surprised me is how very experienced, dyed-in-the-wool cattlemen don't know where to shoot a cow to put her down. A lot of them still believe it's okay to shoot them right between the eyes. And so when a situation like this happens, we need to get clear with those producers. Guys, don't shoot them between the eyes, and give them the proper location of where to shoot them. Again, there's a lot of emotions out there. People get tired of hearing gunshots. It gets old fast. Even people who weren't involved with the cattle or the neighborhood struggled emotionally with this situation when they went to try to help. As far as equipment's concerned, you're probably primarily going to need firearms, quite a bit of ammunition, loaders and bulldozers, because a lot of equipment will be lost in the fire. So it's usually the way the ag community pulls together. It's usually pretty easy to get local neighbors that weren't affected by the fire to bring in equipment. But this happened in the spring. The cattle were decomposing, and so there wasn't a rendering service that could haul all of them away, so they had to dig and bury them. And they also needed loaders to unload and reload hay that was donated. There were horses lost in the fire. There were ATVs that were burned up, so that's just some things that you don't really think about happening in that case. So, and I'm going to move right on into blizzards because my time's short here. The only good thing about a blizzard is that we usually have a couple days notice, and I've been through several of these in the last few years. The cattle are usually contained. They're crowded in the pen corners. They'll get trampled in the pen corners, mired down in mud, and because of that, you're going to have to send somebody out to actually move the cattle out of those corners and find the cattle that need help or need euthanized. This is a picture from ice storm at New Year's Eve of 2006. And it's just one of the reasons why we won't send pen riders out in that situation, because they all look sick. I mean, that's a calf. There's his nose, there's his ear tag. MFA in Missouri recognized that tag as one of their preconditioning programs, and so they used this picture in their advertising for a few years because that's how tough their cattle were. They could withstand an ice storm. Most cases in this situation won't require restraint because they're typically mired down, they're hypothermic, and they won't move. But they need your help to be dismissed from this life. Even the healthy cattle won't want to move too much. And by virtue of that, because there's so many pens in a feed yard, you might need multiple people going out, so you'll need multiple euthanasia tools. Insurance, most of these cattle have insurance, so the insurance company wants you to necropsy 10 to 20%. But my focus was always making the live cattle comfortable. But the insurance company's breathing down your neck because they want to know how many of them were truly due to the blizzard. Nice thing about feed yards is they are fairly self-sufficient on rolling equipment, loaders and tractors and that sort of thing. So you wouldn't have to bring in a whole bunch of rolling equipment. But the other end of that on the necropsies is it's usually cold, and so the cattle are going to get decomposed more slowly, and the rendering service a lot of times can take care of it. So that we got different types of disasters, and each of them has a different objective. With foot and mouth disease, we're trying to stop the spread of disease and safeguard our market. And wildfires and blizzards are primarily trying to end suffering. But those are some situations that mass euthanasia and or depopulation are required, and some of the challenges we have in facing those. And that's why I think it's important that we consider all these, because a lot of times we just think about we got to get them dead, and then we don't think about the aftermath or what may limit us from getting them dead.